So, good morning. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. So, welcome back, everyone. I hope your Thanksgiving was filled with thanks and with giving and with lots of turkey and lots of pie. Ours certainly was. We're very thankful to have you all here today for our Business Over Breakfast session. Organizations have weathered a host of changes in 2020, and they're continuing. And it really has affected us both sort of personally, our teams, businesses, and communities. And this morning, we're going to focus on issues of inequality and social justice, which have also come to the forefront this year. And organizations have been tasked with acknowledging and addressing a wide range of social issues within their own walls, and in many cases, the larger community as well. It's a big undertaking, but for those who view this as an opportunity, we see a path forward to even greater success through an engaged workforce, a strong culture, and the ability to harness the power of diversity within our organizations and within our communities. While there are many facets of inequality, this morning we're going to focus on differences in class and how a culture of authentic collaboration can begin to close the gap between employees of different socioeconomic backgrounds. We're fortunate to have Professor Andrea Dittmann with us today to lead the discussion on this issue. Andrea's expertise lies in understanding the sources of and solutions to inequality in the workplace. She works at the intersection of business and behavioral science to better understand how an individual's background shapes their strengths and obstacles in the professional workplace, and how organizations can develop interventions that reduce inequality and improve organizational outcomes. Andrea has her PhD in Management and Organization from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management and currently teaches Management and Organizations at Goizueta. And her work has been featured in leading journals, including Harvard Business Review, Politico, and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, among others. In recent months, Andrea has been studying how the COVID-19 pandemic affects people from different social classes across a number of domains, including work, relationships, and mental health. Her work continues to provide valuable context, understanding, and solutions for organizations working towards greater equality. And we're lucky to have her here with us today, because last time we tried to have this session, Atlanta's weather did not cooperate, and I think we had really heavy storms that took most people's power and internet out. So we're glad to have you here today, Andrea. Andrea is going to spend about 30 minutes discussing how organizations can use collaboration to address issues of inequality, followed by Q&A. However, she's happy to answer any clarifying questions along the way. So please write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will try and address some as they arise, and others at the end of the session. Over the next 2 weeks, we're taking a slightly different tack. We're going to be joined by two executives, Francisco Crespo, who was until recently the Chief Growth Officer at the Coca-Cola Company, and Rohit Verma, the current CEO of the Crawford Company. And they're going to bring you some perspectives from the C-suite on different aspects. So the only thing for me to say is enjoy the morning with Andrea. I know I'm going to, and I look forward to seeing everybody next Thursday. Thank you, Andrea.
Nicola. Good morning, all. I am so excited to be here, and I just want to say quickly thank you to Goizueta Executive Education for having me speak at this webinar series. And I'm really excited to share with you today some of the work that I've been doing over the past 6 years that studies how organizations can harness collaboration to reduce social class inequality in the workplace. And as Nicola mentioned, this is my main area of research. It is what I did my dissertation on, and so it's something that I think about literally every day and have been thinking about every day for about the past 6 years. So I want to talk about how we can harness a common feature of our modern organizations, collaboration, and make sure that it works to its fullest potential to help reduce social class inequality in the workplace. And so I'll just start by taking a quick moment to tell you a little bit about myself. As Nicola mentioned, I am an assistant professor here at the business school in the organization and management area. I transplanted to Atlanta from Chicago, where I spent about the last 8 years working and also then earning my PhD in management and organization from Kellogg. And really my work has focused on publishing academic articles, book chapters, and popular press articles on social class and inequality in a couple key institutions in our society, both in higher education and in these white collar professional workplaces. And the work that I'll share with you today is a blend of the work I've done in both of these domains. And so if we sort of take a step back and turn to the popular press and kind of the dominant narrative that we see when we think about social class inequality in the US, we can look to see what the headlines in the popular press are telling us about modern social class inequality in the US. We see that it often focuses on inequality and gaps between people from working class contexts and their more advantaged counterparts from middle class and upper class contexts. For example, we can see how there are headlines about what happens after these low-income graduates graduate from college, how they're still continuing to struggle with their careers and status. We see articles about how being born rich still leads to more success than working hard. We have evidence now for this class pay gap, whereby we see these gaps in pay between middle class and working class individuals. And we even have some evidence for this idea of a class ceiling, which is actually suppressing this American dream. And so, what this narrative is implicitly reinforcing is this idea that somehow people from working class contexts are lacking or deficient in skills compared to their counterparts from middle class backgrounds. And if we turn to a small body of research in management and organizations about these social class disparities, we see a very similar tale. We see that even with college credentials, people from working class backgrounds are less likely to receive a callback for an elite job. They are 34% less likely to advance to a leadership position once they are in a job. And they are earning on average 17% less than their counterparts in middle class backgrounds. And again, this is really striking if we think about it, because these are all individuals who on paper are having the same college credentials, the same qualifications. And yet we're still seeing these disparities by social class emerging. And so at this point, you're probably noticing a trend. We talk a lot about the obstacles that people from working class backgrounds face. And it's clear that these obstacles are real and definitely difficult to overcome. But what I want to argue is that this reflects only half the picture. And truly, it is only half the picture that I saw in some of the research that I've done. So I did a series of interviews with MBA students who came from different social class backgrounds. And while they readily acknowledged the challenges they had experienced growing up, they also identified strengths that they had felt they had from growing up. And I think Adriana's experience really summarizes this perspective quite well. She says, knowing that I came to my full-time job at a little bit of a disadvantage, I knew that I had to work a little harder. But at the same time, there were a lot of great skills and values that my parents taught me. So it was just realizing that sometimes the disadvantage was an advantage. And so Adriana's realization that her class background could be both a source of disadvantage and a source of advantage hints at this possibility, not that people from working class backgrounds are deficient or lacking, but that instead people from different social class backgrounds might develop different sets of skills as a function of the social class context in which they were raised. And so that is exactly the premise that I want to start from in my research. So my research not only seeks to document these gaps and obstacles that people from working class backgrounds face, but also strives to document the unique strengths of people from working class contexts. And to take this strengths-based approach is not just an overly rosy or optimistic approach to research. To do so really will help us more fully understand social class inequality, both sides of the coin. And it requires us to take a very nuanced look. We don't want to look just at individuals, which might lead us to assume that people from working class backgrounds are somehow lacking or deficient, but we also want to look at the contexts that they are participating in, the schools and the workplaces that they are part of, and how the work that they're doing in those contexts is structured. And so today I'll be looking at a key source of variation in the structure of organizations, which is whether people are working together or individually. And I'll get more into that in just a moment. But what I want to do is just take a quick moment to get us all on the same page about how I'll be using the terms social class background. And so my research builds on a lot of research in this area, and we use parental educational attainment to classify individuals based on their social class background. And this is based on lots of research that shows kind of the benefits across the lifespan of obtaining a four-year college degree. And so this sort of serves as this demarcation between the top half and the bottom half of the social class divide in the US. So we'll classify people as coming from a middle class background if they have at least one parent or guardian with a 4-year college degree. So they are not the first person in their family to go to college. And again, this confers many advantages to those individuals because their parents are not only able to tell them about, the secret ways to get through college, they're also able to sort of prepare them for the workplace, the white collar jobs that they'll likely have after graduating from college. In contrast, we'll classify individuals as coming from a working class background if they are the first person in their family to go to college, so a first generation college student. So neither of their parents or guardians has a 4-year college degree. And again, because their parents have not gone to college themselves and are likely in blue collar jobs, they're not as able to sort of pass on knowledge about how to navigate colleges and white collar workplaces later on. And so again, that's why we're sort of drawing this key distinction between working class and middle class. And if you'd like to learn more about sort of the foundational research underlying my own research, you can look at this Harvard Business Review article. I would turn you to this article that was written recently by some of my collaborators, Nicole Stevens and Sarah Townsend. And what they review is a large body of research that has shown that this American dream we have, this very individualistic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach, it's not equally accessible to people from different social class contexts within the US. And that really is because the material realities differ extremely across different social class contexts in the US. So in middle class contexts, people on average tend to have greater access to economic capital. As I was mentioning, they have college degrees, they're likely working in white collar jobs, and they have higher income. And so this affords them, a greater level of material resources. In turn, they have fewer environmental constraints that they have to deal with. Again, having more resources at your disposal makes it easier to sort of pay for something. If an unexpected constraint does come up in your environment, you're able to just sort of pay for it and make it go away. And in turn, you also have more opportunities for choice, influence, and control. If you feel as though you can make choices and influence your situation and kind of control your environment, that is going to really help sort of scaffold this individualistic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach that is so dominant in the US. But this is not as much the reality in working class contexts. So comparatively, in working class contexts, people tend to have less than a college degree, blue collar jobs, and accordingly lower incomes. And so what all this translates to is the idea that they have less access to economic capital overall. And in turn, this means that they're typically faced with more environmental constraints. If you only have enough material resources to sort of survive paycheck to paycheck, you're not as able to sort of overcome or pay to make things go away when constraints come up in your environment. And in turn, this translates into having fewer opportunities for choice, influence, and control. Again, if you have fewer material resources to sort of deal with these unexpected issues that arise in your situation, you're going to be more focused, instead of influencing the situation, on sort of adjusting to the constraints in your environment. And again, this material reality is going to set you up less to be able to sort of endorse this individualistic ideal that we have in the US. And again, these material realities importantly shape people's norms and values. And I know that we have a lay understanding of norms and values, but I just want to quickly define how I'll be using that term in this talk. And so when I say norms and values, I just mean cultural understandings of how to think, feel, and act in the world. So again, your norms and values are shaping everything from, the thoughts that you're having all the way to the way that you're behaving out in the world. And what we see are two main sets of norms and values that are different across different social class contexts. So we see that middle class people tend to have a more independent understanding of their self. They understand their self and behavior as separate from others in social contexts. And again, this is shaped by the relatively higher levels of material resources that they have in their environment. It enables them to be a more independent actor in their environment. In contrast, we see that in working class contexts, interdependent norms tend to be more prevalent, and that understands the self and behavior as connected to others in social contexts. And again, if you think about how you may have lower resources when you're in a working class context, that's going to require you to sort of work together with your family or your loved ones and sort of collectively hang in there together to kind of accomplish and overcome these obstacles. So it's going to require you to kind of develop closer and more tight relationships with others compared to people in middle class contexts. And so in my research, I wanted to build off this finding that people from different social class contexts in the US have these different norms and values, and look at two types of behavior that are really important in the workplace and that are likely to be sort of differentially aligned with the norms and values of people from working class contexts. And so those behaviors are working individually and working together. And so when I say working individually, I'm sure you can already think of numerous times in your school and professional lives where you've worked on things individually. I just mean completing an individual task on your own or achieving an individual goal. And so to get to the point that you are at in your career, you probably had to do a lot of things by yourself. You probably took an individual SAT or ACT exam. Maybe you took the GMAT. You've probably worked on a number of projects as an individual in your own working lives. And what I want to argue is that, working by yourself is not going to be as well aligned with these interdependent norms and values that tend to be more prevalent in working class contexts. Instead, though, if we have people working together or coordinating with other people to complete a collective task or achieve a shared goal, so, working on a group project, what I want to argue is that it's going to be very well aligned with these interdependent norms and values of people in working class contexts. So working together should feel more comfortable and natural to you because it's better aligned with the working class norms and values. And again, to return to my interviewees, I have some evidence that suggests that working class interviewees kind of recognize that working together might be one of those sources of strength that they brought with them to the workplace. And so Morgan explains, my social class background enabled me to relate, to interact with, and create rapport very easily with people of very different backgrounds. I think I'm good at talking about things that multiple groups of people feel like they can contribute to. And so what Morgan is really saying here is that whatever walk of life you come from, he's going to be able to connect with you. He's going to be able to find some common ground with you and make you feel included in that group conversation. And this, again, really highlights that interviewees from working class backgrounds really felt they had these unique strengths working together. And indeed, this was something that was unique to my interviewees from working class backgrounds. Overall, 63% of my interviewees from working class backgrounds cited this ability to work well with others as a strength, whereas just 26% of my interviewees from middle class backgrounds cited this as a strength. So these interviews really led me to ask this question that I want to seek to answer in the studies that I'll share with you today, which is whether actually working together might benefit employees from working class backgrounds. So in contrast to all those studies that we saw previously in this talk that show all these social class gaps, if we instead have people working together on tasks, is that actually going to lead people from working class backgrounds to sort of harness the unique strengths and skills that they develop in working class contexts? So, okay, so to just summarize kind of where we've come so far in this talk, what I want to suggest across the studies that I'll share with you today is that working individually is going to systematically disadvantage working class individuals. And that's because working individually is not going to be very well aligned with the norms and values of people from working class contexts. And so while they're working individually, it's going to lead them to have worse experience. It's not going to feel very comfortable or natural or aligned with their norms. And we know that if you are having a worse experience doing something, you're also likely to perform worse. In contrast, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Andrea. There are a couple of clarifying questions that have come through that we're hoping that you could take. First off, can you speak more specifically to the role that culture plays in working class backgrounds?
Yes, yeah, for sure. So I mean, the approach that we take really is a sort of a cultural, psychological approach here. So what we're trying to do is, understand kind of the material and the structural realities and the ways that those sort of lead to kind of disparate thoughts and beliefs and actions. And these are things that are, neither is, one is not better than the other. It's just sort of different ways of responding to your environment in ways that are sort of adaptive to that environment. So the reason that we see people in working class contexts developing these more interdependent norms, it's something that's very adaptive. If you have fewer resources, you have to kind of figure out alternative ways to get things done, to kind of navigate through your environment. And so what we see is that by kind of bonding together and sort of, if I give you a ride to work and then you can, pick up the kids on the way home, things like that, sort of working communally and collectively together to accomplish goals is something that makes it more feasible to kind of reach your goals in working class contexts. Whereas in a middle class context, again, if you have, higher access to these resources at your disposal, you can sort of, again, maybe hire someone else to do something for you instead. So again, it's this chain that sort of looks fundamentally at the resources that are available in the context and then sort of understands how people develop different adaptive styles of responding to either the absence or the presence of constraints in their environment.
Thank you. No, that was definitely helpful. The second question is asking about some of the sources that you're citing, and they're wanting to know, are there more current studies that show how things may have shifted or may be shifting?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. You know, that's why it's always relevant to be studying social class and the way things are changing. You know, I know there's lots of research in economics that shows that if anything, you know, social class inequality is only on the rise in the United States. It's only been kind of increasing, and we know, and I know from some of my own research as well, that this COVID-19 pandemic has certainly exacerbated some of these are existing inequalities. So I think it's something that we need to kind of constantly be aware of and checking into. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely more contemporary studies that are sort of showing that these disparities are still existing, and it's not, if anything, kind of worsening potentially. And we'll see how long lasting those effects are. But yeah, I think it's definitely something we need to be constantly, you know, aware of and continuing to update is kind of where we're at with social class inequality in the U.S.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any more questions for clarifying? Or are we set to go on?
Oh, wow, you've opened up the floodgates.
Oh.
There is one, working together related to generation gaps. And this is more of a statement and clarifying question. It says millennials are more likely to work together than working individually, while more seasoned professionals are more aligned to working individually. And so I guess their question is, could working together related to generation gaps? I'm sorry, that's not really clear. But I hope.
No, that's fine. You know, I'll be getting to some implications later on, but I completely agree with you that collaboration is on the rise in workplaces. You know, jobs continue to get more and more specialized. So I think it's something that, you know, this research is something that's going to be becoming even more relevant. And so we'll see how, you know, despite the fact that collaboration is becoming, you know, a very prevalent sort of dominant mode in the workplace, it really matters whether you have these authentic collaborative values, and I'll talk a bit about that, to really harness, you know, the full potential of individuals from working class backgrounds. So I think that's a great way to sort of transition into some of the studies that I'll be sharing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, again, what we want to suggest here is that working together is actually going to benefit employees from working class backgrounds. And again, that's because it's going to be pretty well aligned with these more interdependent norms and values that they tend to develop in working class contexts. That's going to lead them to feel more comfortable and at ease while they're working together. And we know, again, if they're having a better experience while they're working on a task, they're much likely to do better on it as well. And so what I'll do today is share with you just briefly 3 studies that we've done in this area of research to look at how working together might actually benefit employees from working class backgrounds. And the first 2 studies will be focused in specifically on these organizational practices, so whether people are working as individuals or in teams. And then we'll sort of zoom out in our last study and we'll think about how teamwork operates in organizations and the role of these broader, authentic collaborative values as a critical determinant of whether we can see these benefits for employees from working class backgrounds. And if you're interested in learning more about this program of research, I recently wrote an article for this online magazine, The Behavioral Scientist, and it really hopefully summarizes in an approachable way this program of research and some of the other studies that we've done in this line of research. So I'd be happy to share that with you after the talk if you're interested to learn more. Okay, so our first study that we did was to look at actually college course grades. So this is just kind of the first proof of concept test of our ideas. And we were able to exploit a really nice feature of an undergraduate management class. And this is, the principles of organization management class that I teach here at Goizueta. It wasn't a study done at Goizueta, but it is, the exact sort of introductory organizational behavior class that we have our undergraduate business majors taking. And the really nice feature that we were able to exploit about this class is that people in this class are working on 2 types of assignments. On some of the assignments, they're working individually. They're taking individual homework assignments and individual final exams. But on other assignments, they're actually working in groups. They're working together. So they're working on group homework projects and a group final project. And what we see is that in the class, about 65% of their grade came from these individual assignments, whereas the remaining 35% of their grade was these team assignments. And so if we turn to their performance, we want to look at how people from different social class backgrounds were performing on these different types of assignments. So first, looking at how they performed on these individual assignments, I'll be sharing the graph with you here. You'll see on the x-axis, we'll have bars representing students from working class backgrounds and students from middle class backgrounds, and then again, their grade on the y-axis. So of course, higher grades reflect better performance in the class. And what we see is not at all surprising based on all the research that I shared with you earlier in this talk. We see that students from working class backgrounds are performing significantly worse. They're earning significantly lower grades when they are working on these assignments individually. And, a 2% gap is a pretty large gap in terms of, overall sort of assignment grades on 65% of the grade of their class. And so again, this is very consistent with lots of research that's shown a social class achievement gap in college. But we actually see a very different pattern of results when we instead turn to the team assignment grades. And so the way that we're able to kind of look at the effect of social class on team performance here is we looked at the number of working class students on a team. So these were teams of about 6 to 8 students. And so we see here on the x-axis that we had groups that ranged from having no students from working class backgrounds in them to all the way up to 4, which would be about half to 2/3 of the group. So a fair percentage of the group. And what we see, and this is very much the opposite of what we saw for the individual grades, we see this positive linear trend whereby having more working class students on a team is associated with higher team performance on these team assignments. And I really want you to stop and think for a moment here about this. Based on the findings that I shared with you about the individual assignments, you would expect to see the exact opposite pattern. You would expect to see teams with more students from working class backgrounds doing worse, but we see the exact opposite. And again, this is very much in line with our predictions and our theorizing. And so we were very excited and very encouraged to sort of see evidence of this happening out in the real world. Again, I'm an experimentalist by training. So again, this is only a correlational study. So, we can say that there's this association seemingly between social class and team performance. But next, what I wanted to do is conduct a lab experiment to be able to draw some causal conclusions about the effect of social class on team performance. And so what we did in this lab experiment is we brought participants into the lab and we randomly assigned them to work on the exact same task, either individually or in a group of 2. And then because of the task that we used, and I'll share a little bit more about that task in just a moment, we were able to assess their actual performance on this task. And then we were actually able to video record the groups working together on this task. And then we had research assistants code their behaviors to try to understand the process that might be driving why groups from working class contexts are actually performing better when they're working together than groups from middle class contexts. And so the task that we used, it's maybe a task you've seen if you've taken a management class. It's the version of what we use is the Lost at Sea task, but there's also related versions of this called the Desert Survival and the Subarctic Survival task. And this task is it's meant to be a fun sort of problem solving task. You read through the scenario and you're asked to imagine that you're sort of lost at sea and you're stranded and you only have 15 items available for your survival. And your task is to actually rank those items in order of their importance to your survival. And amazingly enough, there is a correct answer to this task. They worked to develop this task with a team of survival experts. So they have a correct ranking of these items based on the analysis of survival experts. And the really nice thing about this task being sort of a ranking task is that when you're working together with another person on a ranking task, you're not really able to sort of divide up the task and work individually. You really have to kind of integrate each other's ideas and work to find a joint solution. So that was a really nice feature of this task for us. And so again, we'll look at their performance on this task. And so higher scores are reflecting better performance, which means that the groups were closer to the optimal ranking of the items based again on the analysis of these survival experts. And so what we see again, we'll look at these performance results. On the x-axis, we'll compare people who were working on the task by themselves to people who are working in groups on the task. And again, on the y-axis, we'll see that higher scores reflect better performance. So when we look at the working individually condition, we actually don't see a social class achievement gap in this individual condition. We see students from working class backgrounds and middle class backgrounds performing equally on this task, but we see a very different and exciting pattern of results when we instead look at these groups working together. We actually see that groups from working class backgrounds, so these were 2 students from working class backgrounds working together, they're significantly outperforming groups from middle class backgrounds. So 2 middle class students working together. So not only do we see that working together is actually benefiting people from working class backgrounds, we actually see that it's leading them to outperform groups from middle class backgrounds. And again, this is the exact opposite pattern that we see typically in terms of the social class achievement gap. We usually see students from working class backgrounds performing worse than students from middle class backgrounds. But when we did a small tweak here of just having them work on that exact same task together, we actually see that they're outperforming. So that was, again, very exciting. And again, we wanted to understand next, why are these working class groups performing better? So to find out, we coded the videos for effective group processes. So things like, integrating solutions, working jointly, that things that we know from previous research are things that make group work go well. And we found evidence for a process of conversational turn taking. So these working class groups were taking significantly more turns. They were having more active and balanced conversations than the groups from middle class backgrounds. And so just to make this a little bit more concrete, I'd love to share with you a couple examples that highlight kind of the distribution of frequent turn taking to infrequent turn taking. So here I'll share with you the audio of a group that was particularly good at taking turns.
Okay, yeah. All right. So going down, navigational tool, do you think it's still important from these choices?
I think like the most, then again, if we're not trying to if we're trying to get rescued, then like the navigation tool is not that important actually anymore,
okay,
right?
And so is the map of the line negotiation.
So they sort of are like the bottom based on our objective. Right.
So as you could probably hear, and you can see visually in this transcript, this pair of participants was really taking frequent turns. They sort of have an active and balanced conversation, and they're actually building on each other's ideas, right? They're sort of taking this very yes and approach to work towards a joint solution. And so now I'll contrast that with an example of a particularly striking group that had very infrequent turn taking.
I'll put a question mark next to it if that's a possibility. I'm gonna put this as the transistor radio is 13 because it's just to listen to music, so we can rank that pretty low. I think our next goal should be protection.
Hey, let's rank this first.
So again, a particularly striking example of infrequent turn taking. So throughout this clip that you just heard, participant A is really dominating the conversation. And unless you knew that it was actually a group study, you might not even expect that she actually had a partner, and maybe she was just sort of talking to herself. But then again, we see her partner sort of chiming in at the end, but he doesn't really build on her ideas at all. He's sort of just like, okay, now let's do my idea next. So again, a very sort of stark contrast to the previous example where they were really, taking turns and building on each other's ideas. And so again, what we see here when we kind of put it all together is that we see that these working class groups were actually taking significantly more conversational turns while they were working on the task. And again, turn taking is something that really helps groups perform well, because what we're doing is we're surfacing more unique information, we're considering more options, we're really making sure we think through carefully, the ideal ranking of these items before we decide on a joint solution. And that is in turn leading to better group performance. And again, we don't think it's something uniquely about turn taking. We think this is just kind of one example of one of the skills that people from working class backgrounds bring to these group contexts. And we're excited to kind of uncover more of these specific behaviors that they're engaging in groups that sort of make group performances go better. But that was pretty exciting experimental evidence that sort of suggests that there is this causal effect of social class background on team performance. And so again, we've taken a couple studies to look at the role of teamwork versus individual work kind of in isolation. But we're all sort of embedded in organizations, we're all employees. And so of course it's really important to think about how these findings might actually translate to the world of work. So next, what we wanted to do is look at a nationally representative employee survey and see kind of what's happening out in the wild in organizations. So I want to take a step back now and think about organizations, think about workplaces. So up until now, we've essentially been considering the role of these organizational practices of teamwork or individual work in isolation. We looked at college students who were embedded in a single college class. We then looked at a well-controlled experiment, and we see this evidence that teamwork is actually benefiting people from working class backgrounds. But when we think about workplaces out in the wild, we can imagine how there's variability in organizational contexts, and in particularly in the values that they're promoting in their broader culture. And so we want to sort of bring these findings to organizations. We need to not only take into account organizational practices, we need to think about how they're operating in tandem with the broader values that are espoused by the organization. And to sort of make this a little bit more concrete, I'll just share with you a couple examples of a couple high status technology companies that promote drastically different values when it comes to working individually versus working together. So we can look at an example of Amazon, which really has some policies and values that emphasize the importance of working individually. And we can contrast that with Google, which really emphasizes and stresses the importance of working together. So Amazon really emphasizes the value of working individually. At the time that this article was written, they had a policy in place whereby all team members at Amazon were ranked annually, and those at the bottom were actually terminated. And so what this policy is doing is really focusing employees on working individually as a way to be successful. Set aside your relational concerns because you just don't want to be at the bottom at the end of the year. In contrast, we can look to Google, which has a very different value and really strongly values collaboration and working together. Google is pretty famous now at this point for having conducted a 5-year in-depth study of all of its teams to figure out how to build strong teams. In fact, they even called it the quest to build the perfect team. And so by sort of putting all their resources and their best and brightest into solving this problem of how to create a really strong team, what this really signals to Google employees is these emphasis and this value of working together. You need to work together to be successful, and it focuses the employees more so on emphasizing group performance and achievement and working together effectively. And so then if we return to our example of this organization, we can imagine a company like Google that has this very strong espoused value of collaboration. And then, if employees' lived experiences in the organization and the enacted practices that they're engaging in on a regular basis involve frequent teamwork, the values that are espoused and enacted are going to be very well aligned. And we're going to refer to that as having authentic collaborative values. And employees are going to recognize this. They're going to recognize that there is an alignment between what Google says it values and what they're doing at work every day. And what we want to suggest is that this is going to be particularly beneficial for employees from working class backgrounds. In contrast, we can imagine organizations, again, we talked about earlier in this talk already, how collaboration is on the rise and lots of organizations still have to kind of put people in teams to get their work done. But perhaps instead, it's a company more like Amazon, where the espoused value really clearly focuses employees on working individually. And what we have, if you're working frequently in teams, but more of an espoused value working individually, is an inauthentic value of collaboration. Employees are going to recognize that there's kind of this mismatch between what Amazon says it values and what they're having to do at work every day. And what we want to suggest is that this is not going to be as beneficial for employees from working class backgrounds. So again, to test this, we wanted to do a nationally representative employee survey of a sample of employees, all of whom had obtained a four-year college degree and then were working in white-collar jobs subsequently. And so what we had them do is complete this survey, and then we were able to identify whether they were working at organizations that had these authentic collaborative values that we thought would be so important for the experiences of employees from working class backgrounds. So we identified whether employees identified that their organization had these broader values that emphasize collaboration and working together, and that they also reported that they worked together in teams frequently. And so we kind of categorize organizations as having authentic values if they sort of checked both of these boxes, and having inauthentic values if they did not. And so we're going to look at a couple key consequences here. So first, we'll look at employees' sort of sense of fit with their organization, which is a really key organizational outcome. Do these employees feel like they belong? Do they feel, a sense of ease and comfort at this organization? And so what we'll again look at is employees from working class backgrounds compared to employees from middle class backgrounds, and higher scores are going to reflect that they feel a greater sense of fit at that organization. So first, let's look at the results for employees from middle class backgrounds. What we see here is that actually, regardless of whether the organization they're working at has these authentic collaborative values or not, we're not seeing much of a difference. Now, it looks like those bars are a little bit different, but they're actually not statistically different from one another. So it's not really affecting employees' sense of fit if they're coming up from a middle class background, if their organization authentically values collaboration or not. Again, what we see a very different pattern when we instead look at employees from working class backgrounds. We see that they are reporting significantly greater fit if they are working at an organization that authentically values collaboration compared to one that inauthentically values collaboration. And again, I really want to draw your attention to this orange bar here. This is the highest bar out of all the four. So we're actually seeing that employees from working class backgrounds are reporting the greatest sense of fit out of all groups of employees when they're working at these organizations that have authentic collaborative values. And again, it makes sense that we would sort of see that it's not mattering as much for the sense of fit of employees from middle class background, because if you remember back to the beginning of the talk, they've kind of been raised in these middle class contexts. They've been raised with parents that went to college and told them about what it would be like to work at white collar workplaces. So they're not really questioning whether they belong. They're not searching for cues in the environment that signal that they're included there. Whereas someone who's the first in their family to go to college, the first in their family to get a white collar job, they're much more attuned to whether or not people like them are included there. And so when there's this alignment, that's really leading them to feel a strong, strong sense of organizational fit. Now, when we look at another consequence, organizational retention intentions, a very important one, turnover is very costly for organizations. So we want to hang on to the employees that are good and not have to go through that expensive process of, hiring and retraining new employees. We see the exact same pattern that we just saw for organizational fit. So again, we see that the retention intentions are not differing that dramatically for employees from working class backgrounds. But when we instead look at employees from working class backgrounds, we see this large gap emerge where they report, very low desire to stay with the organization if they're working at an organization with inauthentic collaborative values. But again, they're the highest bar out of all four when they're actually working at these organizations that have authentic collaborative values. So again, we see that, working at an organization that is perceived to sort of authentically value what you value is going to lead employees from working class backgrounds to want to stay with that organization. But it's not going to matter as much for the employees from middle class backgrounds. So again, when we think about the findings that we've seen thus far, and we take those findings to organizations, what we see is that working together only benefits employees from working class backgrounds when collaborative values are authentic. So, it's not enough to just put people into teams at your organization to really get that and harness the full benefits. You need to make sure, the culture, the broader culture and the norms and values that your organization is reflecting are also aligned with this collaboration and teamwork. And so, before I get to the final implications for organizations, I do want to connect back to the beginning of this talk, because you might be wondering why it is the case that I had all this research at the beginning that showed all these social class disparities in organizations. So we can sort of connect back to that finding because, again, if you'll remember, I classified all the employees in this sample as working at organizations that authentically value collaboration or not. And what we see is that only 31% of the employees in our sample actually report working at organizations with authentic collaborative values, working at these organizations that actually would bolster the sense of fit and desire to stay with the organization of employees from working class backgrounds. The vast majority of employees, nearly 70%, are working at organizations that do not foster a sense of fit and belonging in employees from working class backgrounds. And again, if the vast majority of employees are working at these organizations that are not fostering these beneficial experiences in employees from working class backgrounds, that might be why when we look at workplaces broadly, we see some of these social class disparities emerging. And so I do then want to connect some key implications that I see of this work for organizations. So here I have an image that comes from a recent Harvard Business Review article about collaborative overload. And what we see is that collaborative work has actually ballooned by over 50% in the past 2 decades. But importantly, what this article finds is that who adds value to that collaboration is uneven. They find that 20 to 35% of value add collaborative work comes from only 3 to 5% of employees. And while they didn't specifically look at employees' social class backgrounds in this study, my guess would be that the people who are adding this value to the collaboration are more likely to be employees from working class backgrounds. So what this suggests is that it's not enough to sort of call upon our employees from working class backgrounds to be good collaborators. We need to be able to train all employees to be able to add this value to collaboration so that we're not sort of exhausting the resources of our underrepresented employees from working class backgrounds. So I have a couple of key implications that I hope that you take away from today's talk. First and foremost, I hope that you'll consider adding social class background to your definition of diversity. There's a lot of push for diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations today, but a lot of that work has primarily focused on diversity in terms of gender, race, ethnicity. But I hope you'll have realized that across the research today, that social class background is another key source of diversity that we should be adding to our corporate definitions of diversity. And I hope that you'll understand the value of intentionally seeking to hire and retain employees from working class backgrounds, given all these strengths and skills that they bring to the workplace in terms of teamwork. But of course, again, connecting back to that collaborative overload article, we need to train all our employees on how to work together effectively. Value add collaboration shouldn't be the sole responsibility of those who are already skilled at working together. We run the risk of burning these people out and then losing out on this talent if we're sort of putting all the load of the collaborative work on just people who are already skilled at working together. And finally, and this is not a simple task, but I think we need to shift our organizational cultures to make sure that we're authentically valuing collaboration. And to do that, what we need to do is to make sure that our espoused values and things like our mission statements or our organizational policies are aligning with the enacted values of the organization, employees' lived experiences of teamwork. And again, not an easy thing to do, but I think if we think seriously about ways to do this, this is the best way that we can hope to sort of bolster the experiences of employees from working class backgrounds. And to just sort of return to my interviewees one final time and highlight the potential benefit of sort of making your organizations authentically value collaboration, we can turn to the experience of William, one of my other interviewees from a working class background, who actually had the experience of working at an organization that authentically valued collaboration. And he felt a great sense of fit and that he was really able to perform up to his potential at this organization. And he says, at my most recent job, one of the buckets that they evaluated you on was the ability to connect with people. I think my upbringing helped me to easily connect with people who are different from me. It's something that's very attuned for me, having grown up going to a public school in a diverse area, speaking to very different people. I feel like that definitely is a strength of my background. And so again, William recognized that the organization that he was working at authentically valued collaboration, and he really felt like this set himself apart. He was able to really shine. And the strengths that he brought that were unique from his background were able to really shine through at this organization. And so with that, I will close and I would love to welcome your questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Great information. Going back to your research, did you attribute or take into effect other factors such as gender and race?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So as when we study, diversity and inequality, it's so important to take into consideration multiple forms of diversity. So, not to get into the weeds too much, but across all the studies that I shared with you, we are also able to add in participants' gender, participants' race, as control variables, and we see that these effects are still emerging. So they're sort of unique to social class background, and it's something that I'm very interested in because people don't just walk around as a person from a working class background. They also walk around, with the gender identity and the racial group identity. And so I think, where this work really needs to go next is to take a more intersectional approach and try to understand how these identities are interacting to shape people's experiences. But since this topic had been so understudied in management at the time that I was undertaking this research, as a first step, what I really wanted to do is kind of isolate these effects of social class background, and then let's make it even more complex and kind of try to understand how these things are varying along with other social identities.
Thank you, Andrea. Can you define your measure for authentic, and how do you determine if the values are authentic versus stated?
Yes, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, but the way that we specifically did it in the study that I shared with you is just, again, looking at, we've had employees sort of fill out a survey that assessed, their values, and this is a methodology that's been used a lot in previous research, looking at the role of organizational culture in employees' sort of sense of fit and desire to stay with the organization. So it's just sort of a questionnaire that asks them about some really specific values that the organization might have around collaboration or working individually. So, items like, the organization values working together, or the organization values working individually, or, the organization really values people sort of sharing information. So we really tried to get very specific about some of those behaviors that we were measuring in the experiment that I shared with you, because again, we wanted to make sure they were sort of valuing the sort of authentic, effective group processes. And so that was the component that we used to measure espoused values of collaboration. And then again, to measure enacted values of collaboration was a little bit more objective and concrete. We just asked employees to sort of report the percentage of time that they spent working and coordinating together in teams. So just the percentage of time on their average week that they were actually working in teams. And then we kind of looked at whether those things were aligned. So whether they were, at this organization that values, it has espoused values of collaboration, and then they're also working together in teams a high percentage of time. And those are the organizations that authentically value collaboration. If you said that you were working at an organization where you're frequently working in teams, but you were like, this organization really values working individually, or it's at individual promotion practices, that would be sort of an inauthentic combination where you are working together, you're collaborating a lot, but those team experiences are probably not going as well, because maybe it's a culture more like Amazon where you have to work together in teams, but at the end of the day, you're going to be evaluated as an individual, and that's not going to motivate employees to be working well together in those teams.
Andrea, is it possible that upbringing and educational experiences of the individual might be more important than whether or not their parent went to college?
Yes, absolutely. So again, I'm not at all trying to be a social class determinist in any way. These are samples of individuals where they have made it to college, they've gotten through college and gotten to a white collar workplace, and we can't undervalue the importance of all the skills and training that they're gaining along the way. But what we want to really identify in this research is that there are specific and careful ways that social class background really, we do carry it with us going forward in our lives, whether or not that's sort of something we're consciously aware of is sort of a topic for a different day. But again, we're seeing these social class disparities even amongst people who all sort of have the same level of educational credentials, the same sort of training. And what we're seeing again is this sort of differential experience with teamwork versus individual work. So it's not to say that individuals from working class backgrounds can't, develop skills around working individually. And of course, I would actually argue that a lot of the individuals that I'm looking at, obviously they had to take the SAT, the ACT, they had to take all these individual exams, succeed in school to kind of get to the places that they're at. But we're still sort of at these high echelons seeing this difference between teamwork and individual work. So it's not to say that people can't change or that people don't develop skills along the way. And in fact, I think the key implication of this research is that we should be doing more training, not just in individual work in our colleges and organizations, but we should also be doing some really concrete training of all employees for how to work well together in teams. Because it's a very different set of skills that's required to work well and contribute to a group as opposed to work well as an individual.
Andrea, can you touch a little about the new normal for the work shifting from on-site to working from home? Are employee performance evaluated based on their collaborative work with teams or more individual performance, able to work independently with minimal supervision?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting time to be trying to study teamwork and collaboration because, a lot of that work that I was doing was, when people were, either in the lab with us and we were, observing them working together in a team or, a survey of employees, that was, a survey conducted before the pandemic began. But again, we actually, one of the studies I didn't have time to share with you today was actually a replication experiment of the one that we did in the lab. And so we had people sort of working in an online environment in the group. We had them working on that same elasticity task, but they only were able to sort of communicate across a chat platform online. And we actually saw, the exact same pattern results in that context. So, that's just one experiment. We need to do more work in this area, certainly to determine if there are any sort of systematic differences between the virtual teamwork experience and the in-person teamwork experience. But that first study is at least suggested that, these things can actually translate to a virtual sort of teamwork environment as opposed to sort of an in-person teamwork environment. But I think that's definitely something that I'm interested in trying to explore and understand the nuances of is this sort of differing in meaningful and systematic ways now that we're mostly working at home and, we're physically isolated, but you might still be kind of working in these virtual teams.
Andrea, how can organizations train their employees and staff to be more well-versed and skilled at collaborating and working together?
Yeah, I think that this is a key question of this research, and it's something that we're working on as next steps to kind of develop interventions. Because the way that I do my research is sort of understand and identify how things are going on, descriptive realities, and then we want to sort of move once we understand descriptive realities to these sort of more prescriptive ways that we can help bolster the experiences of employees from working class backgrounds. So I think a lot of what it could revolve around is some of these things that we know from the groups and teams research that's been done by lots of other management scholars is kind of these really concrete behaviors. We saw that conversational turn-taking was a key sort of determinant of success in that experiment that I shared with you. And so I think really training people in behaviors that you should be engaging in to make a teamwork experience go well are things that we need to train people on. It's things like not dominating the conversation, making sure that all your group members, kind of regardless of their status or rank in the organization, sort of feel like they have equal speaking time. That's the best way that we're going to be able to harness the diverse perspectives and the unique information that individuals are bringing to teams. So things like that. And then, really trying to sort of integrate your solutions, making sure everyone has a voice and then really kind of work to come up with a solution that kind of takes into account all the unique information that's being surfaced by individuals. So I think it's really kind of concrete skills-based training that's going to help, both bolster these experiences and make teamwork go better for all individuals.
Thank you, Andrea. This next question is more of a statement and a question, but it states, wonderful to speak to how working class persons, especially females, can translate experience to strength. Will you also speak to class, ceiling, and crisis of confidence that inhibit these individuals from pursuing top leadership roles?
Yes, yeah. So there's a lot of really interesting new work coming out in this area of social class in the workplace. And so, I talked about sort of an internal reason, like people's own skills and values that they bring to organizations, but we also know that there are some systematic sort of external forces working against employees from working class backgrounds as well. So, one of the earlier studies that I mentioned that a collaborator of mine, Lauren Rivera, has done with some other collaborators of hers, they really find that there is some employment discrimination happening in terms of the hiring process. So we see that employees from working class backgrounds, or people who are applying to jobs, they're not able to signal that cultural fit as much as employees from middle and upper class backgrounds. A lot of these elite interviews, what people end up talking about is sort of shared hobbies or things, experiences, vacations growing up. Things that, people who grew up with lots of sort of resources and cultural experiences are able to sort of speak to, playing golf or rugby, sort of these elite sports or traveling internationally. And those are things that are just experiences that are just not as accessible to people who are growing up in these more constrained working class environments. So we do know that there's certainly some external forces that are going on as well. So I think it's a multifaceted problem. There's not one silver bullet that's going to fix social class inequality. But I think if we sort of try to fix it at multiple points in the process, bolster the experiences of employees from working class backgrounds who are at organizations, but then also ensuring that we're trying to minimize any of this bias that might come into play in hiring so we can actually get these people through the door in the first place is, it's going to be a multi-step process to actually help reduce social class inequality at work.
Andrea, I think we have time for one more question. Could you give us some examples or specific ways that organizations can shift their culture to ensure they are authentically valuing collaboration?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, again, this is kind of the tallest order that I was giving out today as an implication of this research. And it's not an easy undertaking, right? Like, I think, I want to be very nuanced and careful. I don't want anyone to walk away from this talk thinking, okay, I can just sort of put my employees in teams and then we'll be good to go. So certainly incorporating teamwork when teamwork is called for at your organization is a good first step, but you also want to sort of evaluate and take a look at those mission statements, take a look at those value statements that your organization has and make sure that they include collaboration. But then even to go a step further, you want to think about how do we evaluate employees at this organization? Are they still kind of having that purely individual evaluation at the end of the year? Or could we add a component more like the experience of one of my interviewees, William, where he sort of mentioned that in his employee evaluation at the end of the year, they assessed how well he was able to connect with others. They sort of assessed his group contribution skills as part of his individual performance evaluation. So I think if we sort of make our evaluations more balanced, we make sure they're not just focused on individual performance, but also kind of how strong of a collaborator is this person, how much of a contributor to groups is this person. I think if we're sort of making these changes at all levels to make sure we have sort of consistent messaging across, teamwork, evaluation, as well as these broader norms and values, I think that's kind of our best bet to really make sure we're authentically valuing collaboration.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. We really appreciate you joining us today. As one of the attendees mentioned in the chat, this was a very fascinating topic, and we appreciate you for sharing your research and your knowledge with us and our attendees today. We also want to thank our Emory Executive Education team. We appreciate all that you all do for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series, and of course, our wonderful attendees who come back each and every Thursday morning to join us. We've got just a couple of things we want to share with you before you all head out for the day. Coming up next week, we will be back next Thursday, December 10th at 9 a.m. Eastern with the former Chief Growth Officer from the Coca-Cola Company, Francisco Crespo. He's going to be talking about the Growth Leaders Playbook. Again, that's next Thursday at 9 a.m. We look forward to seeing you all with that. We will continue on December 17th as well. And we'll get you some more information about that on next week's session. Of course, we do have a couple of upcoming workshops and different programs that we have coming up here in executive education. Next week, we'll actually be kicking off our finance and accounting for non-financial managers with Tom Smith. I'm sure for those of you all that are repeat attendees, you all are very familiar with Tom. So he'll be kicking off that course next week. And then also in December, we have executive decision making with Goizueta faculty members Steve Walton and Michael Sack. So for more information for any of these workshops and programs that you see on the screen, the link is available in the chat box if you'd like to find out more. Also, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page. That link is also available in chat for you as well if you'd like to come back and revisit this topic with Andrea. When you all close out this morning, you will see a brief survey pop up in your web browser. We do ask that you take just a couple of minutes to give us some feedback by filling out that survey. We really appreciate that. Andrea, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any final remarks or closing comments.
Thank you all so much for your attention. I really appreciate you joining us for this webinar today. It was really great to hear all your questions, and thank you so much for being so engaged with this research. And I would love to follow up offline with any of you if you're interested in connecting. I have my information listed in my email as well as my Twitter account. So please feel free to connect, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you in the future. Thank you again so much for your engagement and attention today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.